Part 1. The Foundation. Chapter 1. The Geometry of Grief. Clara Bennett surveyed the room with the detached professionalism of a structural engineer assessing a poorly built bridge. It was a Thursday in late January, and the Willow Grove Community Center's Pathways to Renewal Divorce Recovery Group was assembling for its first session. The room itself was trying too hard. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a peaceful, if currently bare, Japanese garden. The walls were painted a soft, meaningless taupe. The lighting was carefully calibrated, warm, certainly, but to Clara it felt manufactured. She preferred the clean, uncompromising austerity of concrete and steel. She chose a chair furthest from the center circle, near a potted schefflera that looked as indifferent to the proceedings as she felt. Clara was 42, impeccably dressed in charcoal wool trousers and a crisp white blouse. Her dark hair was pulled back into a severe but elegant twist. She did not look like a woman whose life had just been dismantled. She looked like a woman who had simply signed off on the demolition plans. Her marriage to Arthur hadn't ended with a bang, a confession of betrayal, or a furious confrontation. It had ended from the slow, steady drip of emotional neglect. Like a foundation undermined by water erosion, the structure simply failed over 17 years. Arthur was a successful corporate lawyer who understood assets, liabilities, and mergers. He understood nothing of feeling. He taught her, explicitly and implicitly, that emotion was an indulgence, a distraction from the serious business of life. Clara had been a good student. She'd built her career designing high-rise buildings and transit systems, focusing on stability and load-bearing capacity. She had applied those same principles to her heart, ensuring it carried only the minimum required weight. But the divorce had brought an unforeseen variable, their daughter, Maya, 16, who possessed the alarming emotional fluency of her generation. "It's not the divorce I'm worried about, Mom," Maya had said, her eyes large and earnest over her laptop. "It's you. When are you going to try being happy?" Happy. The word felt frivolous, almost reckless. But Maya's worry was a load Clara couldn't afford to ignore. So here she was, in a room full of strangers, sharing the wreckage of their lives, seeking a tool she didn't believe existed: emotional repair. A man entered the room, and the scattered conversations quieted instantly. He moved with a practiced, unobtrusive grace, settling into the large armchair near the tea service. This was Ethan Reed, Dr. Reed. Clara took him in with her structural gaze. 45, she guessed. He wore a tweed jacket over a dark knit shirt, lending him an air of approachable authority. His face was kind, lined around the eyes, suggesting he had witnessed significant unhappiness without succumbing to cynicism. He had a deep, quiet intensity that was unsettling. "Welcome, everyone," Ethan said, his voice measured, like the first steady drop of rain after a long drought. "For those new to Pathways, this space is for one purpose: to begin the work of relearning the self." Clara watched him, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Relearning the self. She knew herself perfectly well. Independent, competent, secure. There was nothing to relearn, only a few necessary adjustments to the floor plan. As the session began, people started sharing. A woman wept over a husband who'd left her for a Pilates instructor. A man expressed cold, bitter regret over his wasted prime years. Clara listened with a critical ear, cataloging the emotional casualties. She felt a familiar shield drop into place, the professional distance that kept the mess of human feeling at bay. When Ethan finally turned to her, his gaze was gentle but penetrating. "Clara, would you like to share your intention for being here today?" Clara leaned forward, her voice low and devoid of tremor. "My intention," she stated flatly, "is to acquire the necessary psychological framework to transition smoothly to independent living. I am not here for emotional indulgence. I am here for efficiency." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the group. Ethan didn't smile. He merely nodded, acknowledging her boundary without challenging it. "Efficiency is certainly a valuable tool, Clara," he replied. "But sometimes the most efficient route to peace requires acknowledging the mess first. Like an engineer, you have to survey the damage before you can draw the new blueprint." He held her eyes for a moment too long. It was an electric recognition, a professional challenging another professional. Clara felt a flicker of heat, not of attraction, but of annoyance. She looked away, focusing on the dark, winding stone paths visible outside the window. They led nowhere that she cared to go. Chapter 2. The Surveyor. Ethan Reed had spent 20 years in clinical psychology, understanding the dismantling of human structures. He specialized in post-relational trauma, the unique grief that followed not just the loss of a partner, but the loss of a shared narrative. He loved the Willow Grove Center. The Japanese garden was more than a pleasant view. It was a non-verbal co-therapist. It taught patience, the beauty of impermanence, and the quiet resilience of life pushing through stone. He had learned to read people the way a seismologist reads tremors. Most members came in feeling volatile, shaking with rage, sorrow, or confusion. Clara Bennett was different. She came in static. She was perfectly still, perfectly composed. She didn't radiate raw distress. She radiated resistance. She was a fortress, and every glance, every crossed arm posture was a buttress designed to withstand the world. He suspected her professional life as a structural engineer informed her coping mechanisms. She viewed emotions as defects in the system, weaknesses in the load-bearing columns. He knew her type, the high-functioning, emotionally repressed individual who believed control was safety. And he knew, intimately, how devastating the eventual emotional collapse could be when that control failed. As the weeks progressed, Ethan kept a careful watch. Clara spoke maybe once per session, usually to offer an analytical critique of someone else's emotional choices. She was the anchor of pragmatism in a storm of feelings. In the fourth week, the group topic was reclaiming hope in the face of disillusionment. A younger woman, bruised by infidelity, spoke of tentatively signing up for a dating app, hoping to rekindle her belief in romance. The room erupted in quiet, sympathetic encouragement. Then Clara spoke, her voice laced with dry ice. "It seems highly illogical to assign profound metaphysical significance to what is demonstrably a chemical and biological function," she stated, looking only at the teacups in the center of the table. "Love is just a chemical reaction followed by disappointment. Any attempts to relabel it as hope are merely delaying the inevitable outcome." A heavy silence followed. The group looked stunned. Ethan felt the air shift. He knew this was the moment to push back, gently, professionally. He let the silence stretch for 5 full seconds, absorbing the group's discomfort. He locked eyes with Clara, resisting the urge to soften his expression. He saw the flicker of defiance in her dark eyes. "Maybe," he said, his voice low and steady, pulling the tension out of the room. "Love, if defined solely that way, is indeed a chemical reaction, but so, Clara, is healing. Healing is the biological and psychological restructuring of damaged neural pathways. It requires effort, energy, and sometimes a deliberate choice to manufacture the necessary chemicals, like serotonin and dopamine." He paused. "The disappointment you cite is the failure of expectation, not the failure of the core process. And our job here is to rewrite those expectations, not through magic, but through deliberate, vulnerable work." Clara didn't argue. She tightened her jaw, giving him an infinitesimal nod of assent. But Ethan saw the subtle, almost undetectable way her fingers had unlatched from her forearm, a tiny structural relaxation. After the session, when the windows were blurring with the late afternoon sun, Ethan was gathering the group notes. He watched Clara stand still by the windows, looking out at the meticulously tended garden. It was currently dormant, waiting for the spring thaw. She took out a small sketchbook and a technical pencil from her structured handbag. She didn't draw the trees or the sky. She began sketching the precise geometry of the koi pond's stone retaining wall. Ethan knew then that her armor was not just a defense, it was a language. If he wanted to reach her, he had to speak in lines and angles first. He slipped out the back door into the garden, ostensibly to water a struggling orchid near the path. "The craftsmanship on that wall is quite remarkable," he commented, not looking directly at her. Clara started slightly, then looked up. She frowned, clearly annoyed at the intrusion on her solitude, but her professional curiosity won out. "It is, yes," she said, holding the sketchpad closer. "It's dry stacked granite, no mortar. It relies on the precise fitting of irregular stones. It's inherently resilient because the flexibility allows for minor shifts without failure." Ethan knelt beside the orchid, running a finger over a brown, dry leaf. "Resilience through flexibility rather than rigidity. That's a beautiful metaphor, Clara." She looked down at her sketch, her pencil hovering over the drawing. "It's just engineering, Dr. Reed." "Perhaps," he murmured, standing slowly. "But everything we build eventually reflects the mind that built it. We build systems to protect ourselves, don't we? Sometimes we design walls that keep others out, but also hold us hostage inside." He met her gaze. The late sun, low in the sky, caught the amber depths of his eyes. Clara didn't cross her arms this time. She only tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture he realized was her tell, a tiny movement that signaled nervousness or perhaps genuine attention. "The irony of architecture," she said finally, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it in the group, "is that we spend so much time making things solid, we forget that the most important structures eventually require the capacity to change shape." "And it requires tremendous courage," Ethan finished, pulling back professionally, allowing the silence of the garden to settle between them, "to choose the permeable over the rigid." He gave a small, courteous nod and walked back toward the community center's main entrance, leaving her alone with the stone path and the sound of the invisible flowing water. He needed to re-establish the professional distance, but the conversation had left an unexpected warmth in his chest. He realized he was no longer just observing a patient. He was recognizing a kindred architect of self-control. And for the first time in 5 years, the ethical line he had drawn so fiercely around his own heart felt less like a boundary and more like a confinement. Chapter 3. A Change in Color. By week 7, Clara was fighting the urge to skip the group entirely. She wasn't miserable anymore, which felt dangerously close to being content. Contentment, in her experience, preceded collapse. Yet she kept showing up. It was the garden that started the shift. After her conversation with Ethan about resilience and rigidity, she started spending time there, sketching less the structure and more the life emerging from it. The moss clinging stubbornly to the rocks, the way the winter-weary cherry branches promised the violent pink of spring. She found herself thinking about Ethan's words, not as clinical advice, but as actual structural problems she had solved incorrectly in her life. The first physical change came not in her attire, but her apartment. Her ex-husband, Arthur, had always insisted on a palette of corporate gray and stark white. Clara had accepted this as suitable, efficient, and clean. She spent a weekend priming the walls of her seldom-used study. She hesitated over the paint chips, a dizzying array of yellows and blues. Finally, she chose a deeply saturated teal, a color suggested by Maya, calling it Regency Blue. When she finished, the room felt impossible, rich, vibrant, and slightly dangerous. It contained actual mood. It scared her, and yet she made it her new office. "It looks like a room where you actually think," Maya observed, leaning against the doorway. Engineers always think, Clara corrected, dipping her brush into the rinse bucket. No, Mom, Maya smiled, wiser than her years. It looks like a room where you let yourself feel. That week in the group, the topic was dreams and aspirations. People spoke of future travel, new careers, and renewed connection with family. When it came to Clara, she spoke hesitantly, watching Ethan's face for any sign of judgment. I had a dream, she began, her voice brittle. I was in a field of flowers, the kind you read about, wild and bright, completely unstructured, and I was holding a man's hand. I couldn't see his face, but I wasn't afraid of the flowers, and I was utterly convinced I was safe with him. She paused, taking a rare deep breath. I believed in him, she whispered, the confession escaping before she could armor it. Not because I saw him or knew him, but because I felt him. The group didn't offer analysis or pity. They offered quiet support, a wave of palpable empathy that somehow felt more destabilizing than criticism. Ethan, leading the discussion, met her eye. He saw the raw exposure in her expression, the way her guard had momentarily dropped. He felt that familiar lurch in his chest, the strange sense of responsibility mixed with an electric recognition. That's the essence of trust, Clara, Ethan said, his voice soft, professional, yet resonating only for her. Believing in the unseen structure. Thank you for sharing that vulnerability. The fear had been expressed, and the world had not ended. Her structure had not collapsed. In fact, it felt marginally stronger, supported by the terrifying, flexible strength of vulnerability. Later that week, Clara signed up for a beginner's pottery class near her office. She, the woman who dealt only in precise measurements and perfect weight distribution, found herself deliberately making lopsided bowls, learning to accept the messy imperfection of clay. Chapter 4. The Geometry of Coincidence. Ethan was a creature of routine. He shopped every Saturday morning at the Willow Grove farmers market, buying the same dark roast beans from the coffee vendor and the artisanal sourdough from the baker near the fountain. He was reaching for a small, knobby heirloom tomato, the kind that looked structurally unsound but tasted marvelous, when he heard a voice beside him. You have to look for the greenest shoulders, they hold better. It was Clara. She was wearing faded jeans, a soft cream sweater, and her hair was down, falling in loose waves against her shoulders. She looked younger, softer, almost unrecognizable from the severe engineer in the charcoal suits. Good morning, Clara, Ethan said, his voice professional, though his heart gave an unprofessional skip. Dr. Reed, she replied, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. She was holding a wicker basket filled with vibrant, unstructured items, purple kale, yellow squash, and a bundle of fiery orange nasturtiums. No tweed today, she commented, her eyes dancing slightly. I try to keep the academic attire confined to the office, he responded lightly. I understand you chose the asymmetrical route this morning as well. She looked down at her casual clothes and shrugged, a slow, fluid movement. It's a new phase. I'm experimenting with failure tolerance. I wore a shirt that wrinkles if you look at it too hard. They laughed. It was a shared, easy sound. They spoke about the quality of the soil and the ridiculous price of organic basil. The conversation was innocuous, yet it lingered longer than necessary. The professional boundary was present, but permeable, buzzing lightly like a high-tension wire in fog. I should go, Clara said finally, gesturing to her full basket. I have to try to keep these from collapsing on the way home. Good luck with your load distribution, Ethan smiled. She walked away, and Ethan found himself watching the way the sunlight caught her hair, the way she paused to smell a bunch of lavender. He realized that outside the sterile environment of the group, Clara was not a problem to be solved, but a fascinating complexity to observe. His journaling that night was focused entirely on professional ethics, Yet somehow, every line he wrote about the importance of transference prevention circled back to the image of her choosing the imperfect, green-shouldered tomatoes. 2 days later, on his lunch break, Ethan went to the local library to pick up a book on Jungian archetypes. He turned a corner and nearly collided with her. She was holding a stack of books that threatened to avalanche. "Clara, we have to stop meeting like this," he joked, catching the top volume, a biography of Eero Saarinen, the architect. "I think the universe is playing a very cheap trick on my commitment to professional boundaries," she muttered, stacking the books into his arms instead. They stood in the quiet aisle, surrounded by the smell of old paper and intellectual possibility. Clara explained the Saarinen book was research for her pottery class. She was trying to understand organic curves. "I'm learning that the curve is the hardest thing to engineer," she confided. "A straight line is easy. A curve requires constant adjustment, constant surrender to the material." Ethan felt his stomach contract. This conversation was too personal, too revealing of emotional undercurrents. It mirrored the very journey they were supposed to be undertaking in the group, only now it was happening between them, one-on-one. "That's a profound observation, Clara," he said, forcing the conversation back to the surface. "It sounds like you are integrating the lessons well. The change is noticeable." She met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not the armor, but the woman beneath it, vulnerable, intelligent, and profoundly lonely. "I feel like I'm finally learning how to breathe without holding my breath," she said simply. The air between them grew heavy, charged with all the things they were ethically forbidden to say. Ethan felt the insistent pull of desire, the desire not just for her, but for the possibility of connection that Clara represented, a connection built not on the easy comfort of shared history, but on the brave scaffolding of mutual, difficult growth. He quickly handed her books back. "I should return to the center. It was good seeing you, Clara. I look forward to Thursday." He walked away quickly, leaving her in the cool, echoing silence of the stacks. He knew he was retreating to the safety of his structure, his professional role. But the truth was, his structure was already beginning to fail. Part 2. The Confession. Chapter 5. The Test of Structure. It was week 10. The cherry blossoms in the garden had burst open, a cloud of shocking, temporary pink against the relentless blue sky. The mood in the group was one of anticipatory closure. People were talking about their next steps. Clara was even planning a trip to Italy with her daughter. Then the outside world intruded violently. Clara received an email from Arthur. Not a clean legal communique, but a dense, desperate personal note. He had apparently realized the convenience of their shared life far outweighed the emotional void. He missed what they had. He wanted reconciliation. It was an ambush. Arthur was demanding she return to the known, rigid structure simply because he found the uncertainty of independence intolerable. The email triggered a panic she hadn't felt since the divorce papers were first signed. It wasn't love she worried about. It was the sheer suffocating weight of returning to the resignation she had just fought so hard to escape. She skipped the Thursday group session. She didn't call, didn't email. She disappeared into her own apartment, folding back into the gray cocoon she had just begun to dismantle. That evening, Ethan felt her absence like a physical weight on the circle. He tried to continue the session, but his attention was fractured. He understood the meaning of her non-attendance immediately. She was facing a crisis of conviction. He ended the session early. Walking back to his office, he fought an internal battle. Protocol, distance, transference. The clinical rules roared in his mind. But the human connection, forged in weeks of quiet observation and shared accidental encounters, was louder. He reached for his phone. He typed a carefully worded text using his personal number, which she had never seen. He didn't mention the group or therapy. He spoke only of the garden, the impartial witness to their slow unfolding. Ethan, the garden's blooming. The cherry trees are in full color. You should see it. The resiliency of nature often mirrors our own if we let it. He pressed send, breaching a line he had sworn never to cross. He knew the risk. If she reported it, his professionalism would be questioned. But instinct told him that she needed a hand, not a rule book. He waited, heart pounding unnaturally fast. 5 minutes later, his phone vibrated. Clara, what time are the gates locked? Ethan, the maintenance crew leaves around 7. I can leave the back door to the main hall ajar for you. It's quiet there after sunset. He knew they were both now crossing into a tenuous, charged space, a place where the roles of therapist and patient were dangerously blurred, replaced with the simple, dangerous roles of two people who saw each other. Clara arrived precisely at 7:30 p.m. The air was cool and scented with the dizzying, sweet perfume of cherry blossoms. She found Ethan sitting on a smooth stone bench near the pond, watching the dark water. He was wearing the tweed jacket again. "Thank you for coming," he said, standing as she approached. "Thank you for the notification," she replied, her voice shaky. "I needed to see something that wasn't collapsing." Clara sat beside him. She pulled out the email from Arthur, her hands trembling. She didn't have to explain. Ethan read the desperation and the implied emotional contract of control in Arthur's words instantly. "He wants the old structure back," Ethan observed, handing back her phone. "And it terrified me," Clara admitted, her voice cracking. "I spent my whole adult life convincing myself that love was a liability, that control was safety. Now I'm faced with the choice, and I realize I've been building my life on shifting sand out of fear, and now I'm afraid it's too late to learn how to be brave." She turned to him, the raw honesty of her gaze stripping away her engineer persona. "I want to be able to feel the flowers, Ethan. I want to believe in the hand I can't see." Ethan felt the carefully constructed walls of his own self-control begin to crumble. He looked away, focusing on the dark reflection of the moon in the koi pond. He could not maintain the clinical distance any longer. "Clara," he started, his voice thick with unsaid emotion. "I've spent the last 5 years of my life building my own set of professional walls. I believed that distance was integrity. I've guided hundreds of people across the bridge of healing, telling them to trust the process, telling them vulnerability is strength." He turned back to her. "But I've been too afraid to cross that bridge myself. I've watched you, week after week, challenge my own deeply held beliefs about emotional safety, about structure." He reached out, his hand hovering an inch above hers on the cold stone bench. "I've developed feelings for you, Clara, feelings that are outside the scope of my professional role. They are real, and they are profound." Clara didn't move. The silence was absolute, save for the gentle rustle of the cherry blossoms. "I know the violation this represents," Ethan continued, pulling his hand back immediately. "And I take the ethics of my work very seriously. You are in transition, and my primary duty is to your health and stability." He looked her straight in the eye, offering her the ultimate control, the choice. "The group ends in 3 weeks. We have those final sessions to conclude your clinical work. I will maintain my boundary. I will be your therapist, nothing more. But if, on the day after the final session, we both still feel this way, if you are still willing to risk the structural uncertainty, then we can explore what's between us. As two people, no longer bound by these roles, but equally responsible for the new structure we build." Clara didn't answer with words. She simply placed her index finger softly on the back of his hand, a gentle, almost clinical touch, but one that contained the implicit promise of the curve. 3 weeks then, she whispered, her voice steady now, infused with a newfound, terrifying resolve. I can wait 3 weeks. The garden, having witnessed the vulnerability, seemed to hold its breath. Part 3. The Bloom. Chapter 6. The Final Blueprint. The last 3 weeks of the Pathways group were the most difficult and the most productive. The tension between Clara and Ethan was a tight wire, humming with restraint and anticipation. Ethan was impeccable. He guided her through the final sessions with a meticulous professionalism, allowing no deviation, no extra glance. He challenged her intellectualizations and praised her emotional breakthroughs, precisely as he would any other patient. Clara, knowing he was watching, knowing the reward for her final act of courage, threw herself into the work. She spoke more freely, detailing the precise architecture of her isolation, the way she had used competence as a replacement for intimacy. She even joined the pottery class field trip to a local art museum, bringing back a small, imperfectly formed vase. On the final Thursday, the room felt different, lighter, saturated by the scent of the blooming garden outside. The group shared their progress, their closures, their gratitude. Clara spoke last. She stood up, her frame tall. She wore a dress the same shade as the Regency blue she had painted her office, a color she'd once dismissed as too much. She looked at the group, then let her gaze settle on Ethan, meeting his steady eyes. I came here 3 months ago looking for a blueprint for efficiency, she began, her voice clear. I was convinced that love, trust, and vulnerability were defects in the system, emotional weaknesses that led to collapse. She gripped her hands together, a habit she was trying to break. I used to believe that being strong meant never needing anyone. I thought my controlled, structured life was the definition of security. She paused, looking out toward the koi pond. Now I know that the most stable structures in life are the ones that are designed to sway in the wind, that can tolerate the unexpected load. Her gaze returned to Ethan, the boundary between therapist and patient collapsing fully in the sheer force of her honesty. I used to believe love was foolish, she finished, the words now a declaration. Now I know it's the bravest thing we can risk. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to build a relationship without the fear of inevitable disappointment. But I know I want to find out. I want to build something new, not on the fear of collapse, but on the courage to begin. The group offered applause, but Clara's focus remained on Ethan. He gave her a single, slow, profound nod of acknowledgement. Clinical boundary respected, personal connection affirmed. He closed the session, managing the final goodbyes with his usual quiet grace. Clara waited until the room was completely empty, save for the custodian beginning to stack the chairs. She walked out the front door, leaving the quiet center and the waiting garden behind. The pause had begun. Chapter 7. The New Construction. A week passed. Then 10 days. Clara spent the time in a fever of renovation. She finished her pottery project, sealing the uneven surface of her vase. She worked late on actual structural plans for a new city library, a building designed with open, inviting spaces, not shielded vaults. She was intentionally filling her life, proving to herself that her decision was not based on need or dependency, but on choice and readiness. She didn't hear from Ethan. She didn't expect to. If he was testing her, she had to pass. She had to show him she was stable on her own foundation. On the morning of the 11th day, a thick cream envelope arrived by mail. Typed, not handwritten, formal yet deeply personal. Clara recognized the heavy texture of the paper immediately. It was the same stock he used for his professional letterhead, stripped bare of any clinical markings. It contained a single, concise invitation. Clara, the group process is complete. Your transition is stable. I have completed my internal review and resolved my professional boundaries. Dr. Reed is no longer needed. If you are prepared to begin the new architecture, I would like to invite you to dinner this Friday, 7 p.m. at the conservatory. No professional context, just 2 people starting over. Ethan. Clara held the letter, the paper shaking slightly. The conservatory was known for its quiet, intimate atmosphere and its dedication to fresh, local ingredients, real, messy, beautiful life. She accepted immediately. Their first date felt like a negotiation between 2 extremely cautious professionals. They talked about boundaries constantly, not as walls to keep things out, but as guides for where to build the bridge. I need you to promise me something, Ethan, Clara said over the quiet clinking of silverware. Anything, Clara. If I ever revert to my old structural language, if I start talking about efficiency or load-bearing capacity in relation to our feelings, you must challenge me immediately. Ethan smiled, a slow, genuine crinkle around his eyes that made her heart feel buoyant. And if I ever retreat into my clinical language, if I try to diagnose our relationship instead of experiencing it, you must tell me I'm hiding. Deal, she breathed. They talked about Arthur and the painful realization that their marriage had failed, not from malice, but from a mutual agreement to stifle feeling. Ethan confessed more about his own past loss, the relationship that ended because he had become too professionally focused, forgetting that his partner needed him to be human, not just therapeutic. I thought I was protecting her by maintaining distance, he admitted, but I was protecting myself from the risk of feeling that vulnerable again. We're both masters of self-protection, Clara acknowledged. I built walls to keep disappointment out. You built distance to keep the wound from opening again. Now we have to learn to build something together that allows for both stability and permeability. They didn't kiss that night. They ended the evening with a long, comfortable hug, a gesture of mutual respect rather than overwhelming passion. It was tender, awkward, and real. It was the best foundation either of them had ever known. Months later, spring had given way to the deep, lush green of early summer. Clara and Ethan were walking through the Japanese garden, the location of their beginning. The koi fish were sluggish and bright in the warm sun. Clara traced the perimeter of the stone path with the toe of her shoe. She was no longer sketching the walls, but enjoying the view. I still see the geometry, she mused, leaning her head onto Ethan's shoulder as they walked. And what does the geometry tell you now, Engineer Bennett? He asked softly, winding his arm around her waist. It tells me that I used to think being strong meant never needing anyone, she said, her voice weighted with quiet conviction. And now I know true strength is letting someone in, choosing that vulnerability, even when it terrifies you. She turned her face up to his. Ethan's eyes were focused and profound. And I used to think professionalism meant distance, the denial of personal necessity. But maybe the most human, and therefore the most essential, thing we can do is feel, without hiding, without needing a protocol to justify the feeling. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss built not on urgency, but on mutual, hard-won trust. The garden surrounded them, the quiet witness to their transformation. It had weathered winter, survived the fragile beauty of spring, and settled now into the enduring assurance of summer. The space between them, once filled with professional boundaries and psychological armor, was now simply a place of growth, ready for the next design.